Okay, it's my pleasure next to introduce Scott Devlin. Scott showed up on my doorstep almost 20 years ago now as a student looking for a job. And he's currently finishing his PhD work on honeybees, and he's doing some plant pollination and bee competition work for pollination part of his thesis. But the other part of his thesis looks at bees in the brood nest. And a few years ago, the Germans published papers on heater bees, and heater bees that essentially transfer heat around through the brood nest. And Scott has taken that much farther and has got some really innovative information to share with you and some interesting pictures and hopefully a video. So I'll turn it over to Scott, and Scott will, so you've kind of got the big overview of bees in the wintertime. Now you're going to dive into the brood nest and see what's going on in the summertime. Scott?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to share a screen now so we can jump right into this thing. There we go. All right. There. Okay. Everyone seeing honeybee, colony parental effort?
Looks good.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to talk. I'm going to start by telling y'all the honeybee colony is a superorganism. I know we've heard that before, and it's pretty widely known and accepted that honeybee is a superorganism, but here it is in a nutshell. It's a social unit of eusocial animals where division of labor is highly specialized and where individuals are not able to survive by themselves for extended periods. And as you can see by that definition, honeybee qualifies for all of those things, right? I mean, she can't survive by herself, not at all. I mean, a honeybee would freeze to death in no time by herself. However, if she's with her colony, she can survive for prolonged periods of time in super cold environments. I mean, there's some experiments from the 50s where they put bees in a freezer. They put 20,000 bees and 40 kilograms of honey in a single hive body, put it in a freezer at negative 80 degrees Celsius. And that colony survived for about a month. And it, might have survived longer, but they just ran out of, that was the end of the experiment. So together, the superorganisms can band together, as we've learned previous presentation, they can band together to beat back challenges they would not be able to overcome by themselves. All right, so, but let's look closely at one aspect of the superorganism. This is from Peter's work from 2018, so it's fairly new. This is a colony breathing, believe it or not. So look at this little picture, this little A right here. This is our hive body. In blue is cool air going in, in red is hot air coming out. So they are purposely sucking in cool air, blowing out hot air, sucking in cool air, blowing out hot air. But they're not just sucking in cool air and blowing out hot air while they're doing this, they're also breathing. On this blue side, they're actually bringing in oxygen so they can breathe. And on this red side, see where it's heated over here, the red side, they're actually blowing out CO2. So they are respiring just like many organisms do. So they're respiring at a superorganism level. So check this out. This is the same colony, same experiments, but look, this is them breathing. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Oxygen in, CO2 out. And that is a pattern. They breathe, they take a breath, quote unquote, breath every 3 minutes in the active part of the day. This is all during summertime. However, at night, they kind of cool down because this black bar shows they're breathing. This is over time, middle of the day, midnight, middle of the next day. Now these little branches up here show what a 3-minute chop, the 3-minute section of what's going on right here. So they're breathing a lot in 3 minutes. Every 3 to 4 minutes, they're taking a breath, right? However, at night when they're less active, there's no foragers going on. All they're doing is processing the honey. And many of those foragers are actually sleeping. Foragers do sleep at night. They take fewer breaths. Again, they get active. They take a lot of breaths. Just like an animal, if it starts running, has to breathe harder. And these colonies are doing the same thing. Now check, and if that didn't convince you of superorganism, check this out. This is same thing, except it's a human breathing. CO2 in, oxygen in, CO2 out. Oxygen in, CO2 out. Now, doesn't that pattern look very similar to the one we just looked at? Look at it. It's almost identical. So, and I show you this just to drive home the fact that this thing we call a honeybee colony, this family of bees living in these little boxes that we've provided for them, they are a superorganism working together to accomplish what they need to get done. But breathing is not the only thing that they do, okay? So, and we're going to talk about heating. That's what I'm concentrating on. That's what all my research is on. That's what I love to look at. But first, let's and I just about, I give this presentation to other scientists all the time. And so I have to discuss with them the various members of the colony. Now, I know that all y'all know the various members of our colony, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, okay? This is just the members of our superorganism. Our superorganism, this honeybee colony, is made up of 3 castes or types of bees that do different things. The fewest members of our organization, fewest members of our superorganism is the queen. There's only 1 per colony. She's the mother of everybody in that colony, and she's the only reproductive member of the colony. Next, we have the workers. Now, they're the most. There's more workers than anything else. And they do all the work. Basically, their name pretty much gives it away, right? They collect the honey, they process the honey, they collect the pollen, they raise the young, they do everything that needs to be done. And then finally, we have the other side of our reproductive coin. We have the drones, the males. They only exist in the colony at certain times of year during the reproductive seasons of the year. And we'll talk about that a little bit later here in a minute. But they don't do anything. Yeah, that's not necessarily true. There's some evidence that has shown that they will participate in air circulation sometimes, if they feel like it. And when they're inside the nest, their thoraxes are usually about 2 degrees warmer than ambient. And so just by doing that, they are actually participating to overall colony heating. But they don't do a whole lot, and they don't do anything, comparatively speaking to what these workers do. So that's the members of our colony. Again, I realize you're all beekeepers. This is all review, but it's fun to talk about it, right? All right, now, remember the other requirement of our superorganism was that not only that it cannot survive by itself, the superorganism must have a division of labor. And this here is our division of labor. And this is from Seeley's work way back in the 80s. Now, this takes a little bit of explaining. If you look at the y-axis, this is the probability that that individual bee is doing a certain thing, okay? And then the x-axis down here is the age of the bee after emergence. So it's 5 days after emergence, 10 days after emergence, 15, etc. And so as you can see, they have different jobs. Here are nest center jobs, cleaning cells. High probability of doing that when you're very young. And then they start feeding the brood. And they'll feed the brood, for 5 to 12, 15 days after emergence. But see, it drops off real fast, right? And then they pick up doing something else. Like, look, feeding nest mates. Right when it drops off, there's they're feeding nest mates. They are attending the queen. If we keep going, look, this really shifts over to ventilating as they get really old. And then, shaping the comb. All these things, the division of labor that they do as they age. And remember, that is one of our qualifications to being a superorganism. And it's important that I convince y'all that they're a superorganism, which I'm sure you already have, because I'm going to convince you that they participate in parental care at a superorganism level. Because I'm talking about parental care here, right? But we all know the queen lays an egg and then she moves on. She doesn't do anything to care for that young. The workers do. And so how is she doing in parental care? How can I talk about a honeybee and talk about parental care unless I'm talking about the honeybee as a superorganism? That's where we're going with this whole thing here. So we've got division of labor. We got that they cannot survive alone. Let's keep moving, see what else we can discover about them. All right, so now we know they're a superorganism. They do, breathe. They do maintain homeostasis, a temperature, of specific, well-defined temperatures within the hive. And we've seen that in our previous presentation, right? In the wintertime, we saw those clusters, they're warm, right? So they're maintaining a homeostatic, they're maintaining a temperature they want it to be. And that becomes super, tight and super well regulated around the brood. So let's look at the bruise development. Again, I know you're all beekeepers, so this is review, so I'm gonna go through this slide pretty fast, okay? So queen lays an egg, that's stage 1 of the brood. The egg will hatch and become a larva. The larva is fed and heated by the worker bees. That's the second stage or phase of honeybee brood. And finally, the larva grows into a pupa and is capped, no longer needs to be fed. However, it does have to metamorphosis into the bee that we all know and love, and it still have to be heated by their nest mates. So that's the process of the raising the young. Egg, larva, to pupa. Each one is heated. Only one of the phases needs to be fed. The other 2 need to be heated only. All right. And again, superorganism, parental care, they're doing this at a colony level. This mother, the one who actually creates the offspring, she doesn't do anything to care for them afterwards. However, the colony as a superorganism does. Okay. Let's see what we got here. Now, all of these things I'm discussing costs energy. It takes energy to do a thing. And energy is just defined as work, right? Anything that work costs energy, and work usually puts off heat. So, and I'm gonna show you how bees take advantage of that heat here in a minute. But brood rearing appears to be very energetically costly because as we all know, the brood nest is kept around 93 degrees. So that entire area where they're raising their young, they keep it superheated, and so that they have, you know, unless you study other insects, you don't know that temperature has a big influence on how fast an insect grows. And so if you can keep a constant temperature in a concise range, then that insect is going to grow at a known rate. And that's very important to the honeybee. She wants her offspring to grow at a known rate because she has a very small window of time in which she can collect the resources that she needs to survive the entire rest of the year. Okay, so that's why they superheat that brood nest so well, and they keep it so tightly regulated, because they want to know when their offspring is going to emerge so that they can take advantage of the resources when the resources are out there. All of this costs energy. Making heat costs energy. Okay, so how? Wait, let's look at a colony. Okay, now we did some research a few years ago, and we put temperature probes in our colonies. You know, you've heard a lot about that this evening. No big deal. It's a very common research ploy or research tactic, I should say. Now let's look here. This y-axis, that's the temperature in Fahrenheit. And the x-axis is the date. We're only showing 3 months here. So it's pretty much over the winter into early spring, okay? So, and this red line is the temperature of the cluster, okay? This green line is ambient temperature, and this is in Missoula, Montana. Notice the red line fluctuate. It's pretty low. You know, on average, it was 70 degrees all winter long. So the center of that cluster is kept pretty warm. But look what happens somewhere around February 15th. Right around February 15th, this huge fluctuation stops, and bam, it levels off right here. And that is when they started making their offspring. And so they have to tightly regulate that offspring to around 93, 94 degrees, so they will age at a known rate so that they can use that population to take advantage of the small window of resources, right? Okay, that's got to be energetically costly. And that's what was interesting to me as I was learning the craft of beekeeping and learning the craft of bee research under Professor Broman-Shank's tutelage. All right, so how do they produce this heat? And so we're going to talk about that. They produce this heat by, the thorax is the center of their heat production engine. That is how they produce the heat. Now this is a cross section, this is the top view of the honeybee's thorax. They took the top off. As you can see, they got these vertical muscles that are these right here. They run from the bottom of the thorax to the top of the thorax. Then they have these longitudinal muscles, which run from the front of the thorax to the back of the thorax. And these huge muscles are used for flight, but you notice they're not connected to the wings at all. Isn't that amazing? The biggest flight muscles in the honeybee are not connected to the wings at all. Instead, they distort the shape of the thorax. That's how the wings move. If they pull these vertical muscles pull the thorax down, the wings go up. The longitudinal muscles flex, push the thorax back up, the wings go down. And that's how they flap. Now they do have, 6 or 8 connective muscles that actually do connect to their wings. And those are called secondary flight muscles. And what those do is they change the pitch and the angle of attack of the wings so they can hover, fly forward, fly backwards, whatever it is the honeybee needs to do while she's foraging. But these primary flight muscles, these huge flight muscles are packed into that thorax. And when they are firing, they produce a lot of heat. The honeybee's thorax can get super hot. When she's flying, though, she sheds that heat through convection. She's moving through a medium. And believe it or not, air is a liquid medium. And so when she's flying through that medium, she's shedding her heat. So her thorax does not get superheated. However, if she stands still or if she stays inside the hive and she starts firing those flight muscles, that thorax will get super hot. But she's no longer moving through the air, so she's not shedding that heat through convection. Instead, her thorax keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I've recorded a thoracic temperature as high as 114 degrees Fahrenheit. That is super hot for an insect. And that is, believe it or not, 115 degrees Fahrenheit is the temperature at which proteins will begin to degrade inside of her body. So honeybees literally can push the threshold, the upper limit, to produce enough heat to heat the inside of that nest and to heat and keep the brood at the appropriate temperature. However, when they're doing this, their wings are not moving. So what they do is they fire the vertical muscles and the longitudinal muscles at the same time. And that results in a zero net movement of the thorax, thus a zero net movement of the wings. So when bees are heating their brood, their wings are not moving at all. Okay, so now we know how they do it. Let's talk about what's the implications of that. Because this here is a map that shows the distribution of honeybee research all over the world. So obviously wherever there's a honeybee research going on, there are honeybees. And you can see from this map that honeybees is one of the most successful insects on planet Earth. I mean, she is everywhere. Literally everywhere we have gone, we being mankind, we have taken the honeybee with us. Originally it was for their sugar because, you know, sugar plants don't grow everywhere. And so if you wanted a sweetener, you took honeybees so you can have their honey. But now we take them everywhere for their tremendous pollination ability. Okay, so they're widely successful. And the reason they can be widely successful is because they can control the internal temperature of their nest. And that gives them the advantage of being able to move out of warm climates into the more temperate climates. All right, however, you know, despite this incredible ability to survive, despite this incredible ability to spread all over the world, even to colder regions, Yukon, as we just heard from our previous presentation, they still die. Colonies still suffer and die. In fact, the probability of a naturally nesting swarm surviving its first year is only 21%. And that's because they have to build wax to hold the honey to survive the non-productive times of the year. And that initial investment in that wax production is extremely expensive. Anywhere between 8 and 20 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax, depending on the ambient temperature. And so that huge investment into making that wax makes it that it is very difficult to get enough honey to survive the first year. So only 21% of naturally nesting swarms survive that first year. So honey is extremely, extremely important to survival of these animals. And so I always tell, you know, when I'm teaching beekeeping courses and it's you know, it's a novice beekeeper, I always say, bees don't make honey for us, they make honey for them. You know, they don't make honey so we can put it in our coffee. They make honey so they can survive the winter. All right, not only do they need honey to survive the winter, they need honey to reproduce, believe it or not. This is a chart from Robert Page. It's from 1971, but it's still very good and very valid to this day. And that's why it's that magenta color, so I apologize for that. But the y-axis here is sealed brood, area in square centimeters. The x-axis is time of year. Now, notice the brood goes up, you know, when they can take advantage of the blooms in the summertime. Then it starts to drop down, getting ready for the winter. We all know the top line is workers, bottom line is drones. You know, on average, these are 2 hive body colonies. They kept about 4,500 square centimeters of brood in 2 hive bodies in this experiment. But and put a pin in that and remember it, because I'm gonna come back to that later in my talk. But right now I'm just trying to show you that look when swarming occurs. Swarming occurs in early spring. Before, believe it or not, swarming occurs before the environment is producing enough resources to support a reproduction. Most insects reproduce at the end of the year, after they've built up and they've gotten all the resources they need, they've gotten strong enough, they've foraged, then they reproduce. The honeybee does it in the opposite. Why does she do it the opposite way? Why does the honeybee swarm in the early spring? Because they got to send that reproductive unit out. That reproductive unit has to establish a home, invest in that wax, and collect all the resources it needs to survive the winter. So spring swarming is essential to their survival. And to have good spring swarming, you got to have survived winter with plenty of honey left over. Because that colony, believe it or not, half the weight of a swarm is the honey in their stomachs. So that reproductive unit, that swarm, is going to fill their bellies with honey and then fly away with it. So they have a head start, a little kickstart on how establishing their new hive. And so honey is very important, not only for surviving the winter, honey is very important for winter survival. And there's a picture of our beautiful honey they got to have. So when you think of a currency that the bees are using, I want you to think it's honey, currency. Honey is their money, okay? They need it to survive the winter, and they need it to reproduce. And they need it to keep the colony warm. That's why we have to make sure they have honey over the winter. They'll freeze to death because they don't have the energy to produce the heat, then they'll freeze to death. So honey is vital to everything that they are doing. All right, now, I've said it a couple of times in this talk, and I'm sure you've heard it. You know, people make the off-the-cuff statement, the brood nest is around 93 degrees. Brood nest is around 93 degrees. And that's what I thought going into this thing. But when I finally got my hands on a thermal camera and I turned it on, it looked like maybe that wasn't so. They're not keeping the entire thing at 93 degrees. If you drop a thermometer in the middle of a brood nest, it's probably going to stay 93 degrees. But that's just, the thermometer is just absorbing the average of all the various heats that are going on inside the hive. if I'm beginning to see it's more like this. It's really hot here, cooler over here, cooler over here, hot again over here, cooler over here. And so, and if they can fine tune what needs to be at what temperature, then this high cost of honey may actually be a lower cost of honey. And remember, they need honey to do everything. So if they can find any way to cut corners to reduce the cost, that's going to be better for them. All right. So now let's talk about my experiment. So this here is a newt. We all recognize newts, and it's two, one stacked on top of the other. And that makes it the exact cavity size of the average naturally nesting colony in the U.S. Average naturally nesting colony will choose a cavity that is around 40 to 47 liters, and 2 nukes is around 43 liters. Okay, so it's perfect for testing natural conditions. And I look at this little hole I cut into it. Okay, this little hole allows me to look directly at the a brood frame without ever having to remove it, without having to smoke this hive, without having to pull it out, without having to disturb them in any way. And I'll show you how I did that. So this is what it looks like with no bees right here. So it goes, it's a 5-frame nuke, and there's 5 frames in there. So this little tunnel gets me past the first 2 frames, and it opens me up right on that 3rd frame where they will be raising their brood. So this is what it looks like when there's no bees, and this is what it looks like when there are bees. They just go about their business. They don't care there's a big 4-inch hole in the middle of their hive. They just work all the way around it. They don't think twice about it. So it made it, when I saw that they would behave normally in this situation, I was like, yes, I can do my research. So now I'm gonna show you what I did. All right, so what I did was I pulled this plug out, and then I gently brushed the bees away. And then I took a picture with a regular camera, and then I took a picture with a thermal camera. Okay, so the regular camera told me if it was egg, larvae, or pupae, and the thermal image camera showed me the temperature of each. Okay, so, and I brushed the bees away, took my picture, they would come right back. I mean, they didn't stay off the frame long at all because they knew they had to keep that brood warm, right? Again, no smoke. This is in situ, which is a fancy way of saying in situation, which is a fancy way of saying I'm doing it. It's still in the hive. They were not moved. They were not altered in any way. This is the first experiments anyone's ever done looking at this situation as it is happening in a real hive. And I'm so excited I can be the first to report this. All right, so here's a picture of what I found. Look, first thing I noticed was, oh my word, it's not a blanket 93 degrees. In fact, here's 93. See this little blue cap? It was 93, which is 34 Celsius, and it was a pupa, okay? But look, here's a 35. It's a pupa. Look at it. Here's a 37.2. It's a larva. There's another 37.2. It's a larva. But look, nothing is exactly the same. And check this out. We got a 37-degree larva right next to, say, a 34-degree pupa. Right next to each other. They are making individual decisions about what each what each brood needs in each cell. And that's amazing. Instead of wasting the energy it would take to keep everything at 93 degrees, they're spot checking this thing. They're deciding, okay, what does this larva need right now? What does this pupa need right now? I need to keep her warmer. Don't worry about warming her. I need to feed her. They're making individual decisions. And this is the first look at this. I mean, this is a cacophony of colors, and each one of these colors is a different temperature. So they don't have to make everything the same temperature. They can make individual decisions. Now, I also found by looking at this that on average, the larvae was kept at 37.1 degrees Celsius. That's a lot hotter than the reported 33, right? And the pupa was kept on the average of 36 degrees Celsius. The cap of the pupa was kept at 36 degrees because, as you see, when I take my picture, the IR cannot penetrate the cap. It tells me the temperature of the capping. And I followed through with that, and I found that it is 2 to 3 degrees cooler under the capping than the actual cap. But I feel like the cap represents the temperature at which, the cap represents the effort they had to put into it. Because the cap is 36 degrees. So they had to heat that cap to 36 degrees in order to heat the pupa under it to the appropriate temperature. So I feel like the cap temperature does represent the actual effort, though the temperature of the pupa underneath represents the needs of the actual pupa. And how in the world they determined that just by using their antenna, because their antenna can't pierce the capping either. I don't know. But this is what I found. The average larva is 37, and this is across all summer long, across many different colonies. The average pupa temperature was 36 degrees, and as you can see, that is far from the reported 93 degrees Fahrenheit that we are told in all the books that they keep their brood at. And so, as I said, they don't have to waste the energy to heat everything in that huge brood nest to 93 degrees. Instead, they make individual decisions about what each brood needs. And it adds up to they save energy that way. Not only do they save energy that way, but the cost, even though flight and brood heating are used the exact same mechanism, firing those huge flight muscles, it is metabolically a whole lot cheaper. I mean, almost half as cheap to heat the brood than it is to fly. And there's a lot of reasons that I could talk about as to why that is. But this is not an insect physiology class. Just know that it is metabolically cheaper to heat the brood than it is to fly, even in spite of the fact they are using the same muscle groups to do both activities. All right, so once I realized, okay, pupa and larvae are kept at different temperatures, and neither one of them is exactly, the reported 33 degrees Celsius. How many heater bees are there doing this thing? Because, how much of that superorganism do they have to devote to this act of heating the brood? And so I moved on to a new experiment. Again, I had designed my own hive, and these are just, just a regular observation hive made out of some scrap lumber. Believe it or not, these hives are made out of scrap lumber that Professor Bromenshank gave me when he redecked his deck at his house. So reuse and recycle, right? So anyway, so I built these out of old deck wood. And what it is, this top half is where I will put a frame of honey so that the colony, because it's going to be a very reduced colony, as you can see, so the colony has plenty of resources. And down here, I'm going to put a frame of brood, right? And I'm going to make sure that they have plenty of workers and they have a mother. So it's a fully functional colony. It's just a little bit smaller. And then I put this in a temperature controlled trailer and I plumb them so they can come and go as they please. So they go, they forage, they come back with resources. They do all the things that a colony would do. I'm at my 5 minutes, Professor?
5 minutes is now.
Okay, I'm almost done. No big deal. Y'all hang in there. Okay, so then I take this, put it inside my shed, and then I put this little grid so I can measure, how many square centimeters of brood there is. And then it's got a thin film that does not block my infrared camera. And then I film the bees doing what they do. So I filmed them for 30 minutes. And let me show you, I'm going to have to stop screen. I'm going to have to back out of here, but I'm gonna come back to the screen share. I want to show y'all a video of what I see. Let me go here. Yeah, I'm gonna go back here. Here we go. This is what the IR camera shows me. Let me play here. Now, just a little explanation. This whole thing is brood. Okay, this whole circle I'm circling right here is brood, and I believe they were pupa. These little white dots, these are the heater bees, okay? Watch them in action. This is the inside of a colony as they're just taking care of their young, not worried about me filming them or watching them. And as you can see with infrared imaging, we can easily tell who the heater bees are. Look at, these are some naked cells, and look how hot they are. Even though the bees are done, the naked cells are still pretty warm, right? Because that's how good wax is at storing heat, which a previous presenter, he's talked a little bit about how good wax and honey is at storing heat. But here's our heater bees. And what I did was I filmed them for 30 minutes all summer long, 12 different little mini colonies. And I counted how many heater bees were active every minute. So I played a video for 1 minute, pause, count the heater bees. Played a video for 1 minute, pause, count the heater bees. On some colonies that weren't overreactive, I could count them while they were still moving. And then that way I could determine how much of the population, I'm gonna quit this and we'll go back to the presentation. And that way I could tell how much of the population was dedicating their time to heating the brood. Yeah, get rid of this. Here we go. And this was made possible through the thermal imaging cameras, which we have not had. Well, thermal imaging cameras have been around for a while, but they've been extremely expensive. Over the last 10 years, they've become very affordable. And so we were able to look for the first time into real live bees doing the heater bees doing their thing. What I found was in my little colonies, the average brood area was 227.5 cubic centimeters, or square centimeters, sorry. The mean number of heater bees per brood frame was 28.13. So only takes 28 bees to keep that brood nest at the appropriate temperature. So that means there's 1 heater bee for every 8 square centimeters, which in a population, that's okay, remember I told you that if you do the math, and I remember I told you that the average 2-story colony has a brood nest of about 4,500 square centimeters. If you do that math and calculate it out, this equates to about 1 heater bee for every 34 brood cells, which equates to about, we're at 2% of the colony. So only takes 2% of that superorganism has to devote their time and energy into heating that brood. That's how efficient they are. And part of that efficiency comes from the fact that they are spot heating only who needs to be heated. They're only heating that brood to the appropriate temperature that that particular brood needs. And not only that, they're all running around in there with those super heated thoraxes. You notice those heater bees, they don't get super hot, cool off, move to another cell, get super hot and go back in. They stay super hot. And they move around. They stick their heads inside of cells. They check and see if that brood needs to be heated. They hover on top of capped cells, and they keep that thorax super heated. And I'm currently following them along in these videos, and I'm getting an essay of what they do. And it looks like they spend a little bit more than half their time sitting still, actually heating brood, and about 48% of their time looking for the next brood to heat, staying heated as they are moving from cell to cell. All right, let me wrap this thing up with one last slide. So temperature of active cells are much higher. Brood temperature is much higher than 93 degrees that were reported, which should be an increased cost, right? But a very small proportion of the superorganism heating the bees, and this may very well decrease the cost. Not only that, but it is cheaper to superheat your thorax to heat the brood than it is when you superheat your thorax when you fly. All right, that wraps it up. I'll be glad to answer any of your questions. And I'll stop this screen share so we can look at each other's faces. Okay. I can't hear you, Professor. Professor, you're muted.
Sorry, the flapping gums syndrome. All right. Yeah, I've got some questions that came in on chat. First one,
great,
caused a little head scratching here. Can you recognize what size of or can you have any idea what size of hive entrance is either too small or too large?
Okay, I can speak to that, but not from my research, believe it or not. Professor Seeley's research has found that naturally nesting colonies prefer a very small opening. In fact, they prefer opening only 1.25 inches. And if they have other openings in their cavity, they will actually seal those or reduce them down to 1.25 inches. So natural nesting colonies, which, mind you, will be no larger than a single hive body and a medium super, prefer a small entrance. Now, our Langstroth hives with that huge opening, that's almost 12 to 19 square inches. That is way too big. So from my research, I can't answer that, but I can say that natural nesting colonies prefer a small opening. And I like to keep the colonies that I use with a very small opening, and it seems to be working very well for me.
Okay. So the second one, actually, I know the question of this one, but it actually fits very nicely with the first one. Is there an estimate of % survival of natural nesting swarms into the second year, or in other words, feral colonies?
Yeah, like I said in my talk, feral colonies, that first year feral colony only has a 21% chance of surviving. However, if that feral colony can survive that first year, they then have an 81% chance of surviving every year after that. And you know what the #1 killer of feral colonies are? The tree rots and dies. It takes about 4 years on average for the tree to rot and die, and that kills the colony. Anyway, yeah. So the first year feral colony only has 21% chance of surviving. However, if it can survive that first year and invest in that wax, it then has an 81% chance of surviving, which is, believe it or not, very close to what good hobby beekeepers can get and what most commercial beekeepers get.
Yeah. So the next one, I've got 2 more here that are actually got a debate going on among the people asking the questions. The first question is, do larvae reared outside a colony generate the same high temperatures? And the debate is, the second person said, well, it's not the larvae generating the heat, it's the workers who control that. So
that is true. We haven't done research on honeybees yet, but there have been research done on solitary bees, and the larva is unable to generate heat. They just lack that muscles, the muscles I described to you in the thorax, they lack that musculature. So they can't generate their own heat. They need the heat of those who are caring for them. However, but here's what you need to realize. In all the experiments we have done where we've changed the rearing temperature of our offspring, of the bees, we've only done pupa, because you can only change the temperature of the pupa because they are under the cappings. And if you take them out of the nest, put them in an incubator, they don't need to be fed and they will grow without any help other than the temperature. You can't do that to larvae, because if you raise or lower the heat of the incubator they are in, the nurse bees will kick in high gear and either lower the temperature to what they need it to be or raise it to what they need it to be. So all of our experiments have been done on pupa, not larvae. And larva is unable to generate their own heat because they lack the musculature.
Okay. I'm going to be interested in your answer to the next one.
This is almost as bad as my comment.
Do heater bees live the same lifespan as other workers?
Oh, well, yes, we being they, other scientists, have followed bees through their lives, right? And heater bee is just one step in their lives. They don't stop. They don't stop and say, I'm a heater bee for the rest of my life. They're just passing through, so to speak. They went from feeding the young to feeding the queen to heating the bees, and they moved on to in-hive duties, and they moved on to guard duties, then they moved on to foraging. And there's no detrimental effects to their lifespan from having spent that time in heater bees that we know of.
Okay. So I think you answered the next question here. Is the heater bee a subcaste or a particular age?
It's just particular age, yeah.
And another says, would the numbers of heater bees per cell be increased for a more rectangular 10-frame bee box versus the columnar, column-shaped 5-frame box? And then it goes on to say, this would seem to be in line with Etienne's work on hive efficiency and energy requirements.
There is, as Etienne mentioned, there is a lot of variables that, you got to do colony overwintering success. You're doing colony size versus cavity size, right? And we, being scientists, again, we don't fully understand that link. Okay, so, and I can say it again: natural nesting bees choose a small cavity. We provide them a big, huge cavity because we need their products, right? And when you're beekeeping, you always got to keep in mind your beekeeping goals and your equipment and your values, okay? So I'm not saying it's wrong to have a super large hive. If that's what your goals are, that lines up with your values, do it. But natural nesting bees like to have that small cavity size and they like to be well insulated also. The average R value of a tree cavity is between 4 and 6. So they're well insulated. So all the things that the previous presenter told you is perfectly lines up with what occurs naturally. It's just that they prefer going up rather than going out. And that's because of heating reasons, okay? So they prefer to go up rather than out. But again, I'm not telling you if you got to talk about hive and you love it, I ain't telling you got to stop using that. It's your values, your goals. If you can keep your bees alive, that's fine. But they prefer to go up rather than out. Now, the only thing that increases number of heater bees is size of the brood nest. Okay. So it doesn't matter if it goes up or if it goes across. If that brood nest gets bigger and bigger, they're going to increase the number of heater bees that are currently active, just so that they can stay on top of what needs to be done for that brood. Yeah. Did I answer the question? I think it did.
Okay, I got a thanks on that. The last comment by the person was they were talking skinny cavities versus squat shapes, but I think you answered that. So we've got a couple more minutes that Scott could answer questions. For those of you online here, if you've not used Zoom much before, there's a little cloud type of thing down on the bottom, wherever your Zoom controls are, say chat. If you go to chat, you can click on that, and that's where I'm getting these questions. So, with a large group, it's hard to turn on the cameras for everybody and sort them out. So, does anybody else, if you got a question before Scott's time run up, okay, I got one right away. So while I'm answering this one, if any of you others have questions, use chat to ask it, and ask it to everyone when it says who do you address it to. Say to everyone. So this one says, I hear that bees pump through their heads. And let me see, I got to scroll this. Is that the case for all bees besides honeybees?
pump like for the movement of liquids? I'm gonna answer as if that's the question. They do have a subarachnoid pump in their mouths that allows them to help the movement of food in and out, you know, to suck up the nectar and feed it to other bees. However, their esophagus is just like ours, and it uses, I forget what it's called, but there's muscles in the esophagus that can move food along. I forget what it's called. Anyway, the pump, they're not 100% dependent on that pump in their mouth, the subarachnoid pump. They also have muscles in their esophagus that can move the food. Is that what they were asking? Is there any?
We'll have to see whether Mark addresses that for us. So so now we're getting some more questions. Whoops, we're getting questions pretty quick here. Hold on. Okay.
Peristalsis, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, so question about where to send bees for testing for pathogens.
Whatever bee lab is near you would be your best bet. But they get busy and don't always do it, and there may be a fee attached. Sometimes there's not, but there's a bee lab in Louisiana, Maryland, in Idaho. Idaho's a native bee lab, but you know, with funding being cut all the time, I don't know where they're at on that. And Professor Bromenshank may be able to answer those questions better for you. There are some private organizations that will check bees, but they always will have a fee attached to them. And if you want to do nosema, I believe that Mr. Wick, BVS,
yes.
BVS will do it. Just look up BVS on Google and it'll pop up. He will check for your viruses, and he can check for nosema as well.
Yeah, Dave Wick up here in Florence, Montana, has some technologies out of the Army for fast sampling and looking for viruses. He looks also for nosema, and he just added an instrument that can look at proteomics, which opens up the opportunity of looking at virtually any type of microbial pathogen that might be there in a sample. So, but he does charge a fee, but on the other hand, his turnaround times are really fast, and his fee is really, in my mind, pretty minimal for what he offers in terms of what you get in terms of his analysis. So I got a clarification on the one about the pump and so on the head. Wants to know whether they press their heads against the cells, the heater bees.
They stick their heads, they do inspect the cell. If the cell has a larva, they stick their head in. I assume not necessarily their heads. I assume that I'm pretty certain they're using their antenna, because their antenna has sensors for temperature on. So they stick their heads in, and they tap the larva with their antenna to determine the temperature, and they decide if they need to heat that larva or not. And so they can inspect 3 or 4 cells before they actually decide to heat one of them. But again, I'm very early on into looking and quantifying that behavior. But they stick their heads in the cells. Obviously, they don't do that with the pupa because the cell is capped.
And I'll add my own 2 bits. The German work talks about the bees pressing their thorax down against the cells, transfer heat. So the question of a couple last questions here are: forager bees a natural progression, or let's see. I guess the question, let me rephrase it. I think the question being asked is: are there specialized bees that are heater bees, or can any bee be a heater bee?
As far as we know, most bees were at one time heater bees, and they just moved on as they aged to do other things. So yes, as far as we know, every heater bee was at one time a heater bee as she passed through her progression, depending on the needs of the colony, how big that brood nest got. Clearly, you know, if there were a small enough brood nest, she could have theoretically passed through her entire life stage, never needing to have heat bees, but I don't think that's likely. It's more likely that every bee at one time was a heater bee.
Okay. Final couple questions here. Do you have any idea how hot bees balling a queen or balling wasps are to kill the queen or wasp?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I was interested in that too. And here's what I found. Believe it or not, Apis mellifera is not that good at it. Apis cerana is very good at it. Apis cerana can ball a wasp and kill it in no time. And keep in mind, it's not just heat that they're using to kill that wasp. They're depriving that wasp of oxygen. So they're killing it by asphyxiation as well. Now, Apis mellifera cannot stand as much heat as Apis cerana, and but Apis mellifera is a little bit better at withstanding hypoxic situations. So, there's a little trade-off. They're not as good at heating as Apis cerana. Apis cerana is the Asian bee, by the way. It's the Asian honeybee. Apis mellifera is the European honeybee. They'll heat their thoraxes to around 110, 112, somewhere around that zone. It's just there's so many of them balled up so tightly. And then they deprive the queen or the wasp of oxygen as well while they're doing that. The Asian bee is a little better at getting hot, not as good at hypoxic situations. Apis mellifera is not as good at getting hot, but a little bit better at the hypoxic situation they create. So it's a trade-off. They each do their thing. But the Asian honeybee will do it faster and with less provocation than the European honeybee will.
Okay, last question. So is the heat of the larva, is that a radiation phenomena or conduction by pressing? Radiation off of their bodies or conduction by pressing their bodies against the cells?
It's radiation when it's the larva. It is conduction when it's the pupa, because as Professor Bromwich said, they will stop on top of a capped pupal cell once they determine it needs to be heated and literally press their thorax onto that cell, and that would be conduction. However, with the larva, there's no cap. They just hang around above it, heating their thorax, and that radiantly heats the larva. So the answer is yes on both.
All right, so I'll answer the last two questions really quick. Somebody asked about whether we recommend a camera. We've had really good cooperation and actually used cameras that we borrowed from Fleur. Fleur is one of the very early companies into this. There are several different companies that produce usable cameras, but the ones that are more experienced and been in the game longer generally have better algorithms, and it's also a bit of, you get what you pay for. If you want to get a cheap dongle from a startup company and so on, that may not work near as well as something from an established company like Fleur or Fluke. We've been working with Fleur simply because they've been such a good company to work with, and they were one of the very first working with the military on this whole technology. Somebody else, tongue-in-cheek, asked whether or not we could test bees for COVID. We're not testing bees for COVID, but Mr. Wick's proteomics laboratory has been screening samples from our colleague, Dr. Colin Henderson, who teaches in the nursing program at the University of Montana. He instructs human anatomy and physiology. And during this last semester, Colin has been swiping surfaces and taking samples and sending them up to Mr. Wick for rapid diagnosis. And Colin's happy to report that his classes overall, by social distancing and wearing masks, have been actually staying relatively free of any COVID. We can't say that for the general population of Missoula, but so I'll field those last two for you, Scott. Scott, thank you very much for your presentation. As I said, with Etienne's, I see we have a few more questions, but we're kind of running out of time. Let's see, there might be. Oh, so one last question. Are heater bees present 12 months of the year or just during the brood season?
Just during the brood season. They have the capacity to be heater bees all winter long. When a bee goes, a winter bee, her development is suspended at the nurse bee phase. It's something to do with the buildup of juvenile hormone, but pretty much it stops. So wintering bees are nurse bees. And so they all have the capacity to become heater bees, and they need to become heater bees somewhere around February in temperate zones so they can start raising brood even in the wintertime. So yeah, heater bees is a behavior more than a physiological change in the bee. Okay.
Thank you, Scott.
My pleasure.
Again, thanks to both Scott and Etienne. People are clapping here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thumbs up and so on. And there's comment from some that they can't wait until they can call you Dr. Debnam. So,
yeah. Me neither.